Greetings and blessings, YouTube. This is John the Jansenist, also known as my other account name, Hell's Unicorn. This particular evening, I'm actually going to be delving into a topic that has a good deal of overlap between the various subjects covered on both this channel and the other channel, which is relative based on which video you're watching, since I'm going to be uploading this video onto both channels. Since I am right now predicting that this video will go past the 15-minute mark that is normally allotted for lesser channels, this video will be broken up into a couple of parts on the John the Jansenist channel, and it will be in one bulk video here on the Hell's Unicorn channel. I received a private message from a longtime friend and fellow user here on YouTube by the name of Macaro Guy, and he sent me a link to an article that's actually on Lou Rockwell, which is a news site that I visit very regularly. But this is one that actually slipped past my attention, in part because at the time that the video was, the message was actually sent to me, I was actually indisposed with some other stuff going on. But now that all of that has been cleared away, I will now get into this. I'm going to basically read through this article. I'm going to provide some brief commentary in between certain segments of the article where I have either things to add or things that I actually out and out disagree with. The author in question is Christopher Mannion, who is one of several Roman Catholic affiliates of the Lou Rockwell site and one of many obvious Roman Catholic members of the Libertarian and/or Liberty movement. As many of you may know, I am a former communicant member of the Roman Church. I ceased communion with them back in 2007 after a series of personal events that caused me to re-examine not only my own faith, but the doctrines of the Church, and I have found many of them to be in error, to be inconsistent with the traditions of the earliest members of the Church, and logic would tend to command that in any particular faith, the earlier in the succession of the tradition, the more likely you are to get an accurate picture of things. So, to give just a brief sum up of this article before I delve into it, Christopher Mannion is arguing that there is a problem with the Ron Paul campaign as it relates to Roman Catholic voters. And he argues that the problem is more on the Roman Catholic side than it is on Ron Paul's actual ideological stances. On that point, I agree with Christopher Mannion. Where I disagree with him is on the nature of the problem that the Roman Catholic Church has, and why I would argue that not just Ron Paul, but America in general has a Roman Catholic problem. And I'll lay that out in between the little intercessions that I make here in this article. And now I'm going to start reading this. There is a link for this in the description as well. There are millions of traditional Christian conservatives who have not bought into the Washington culture of the Beltway trough. Many of them embrace Ron Paul's intrepid demands for serious cuts in the size, budget, and power of government. Many more cheer Dr. Paul's drive to end the Fed-driven theft by inflation. In fact, that effort appeals to members of many denominations who honor the commandment, "Thou shalt not steal." Of course, many, but not all Christians who embrace radical dispensationalism have a different set of priorities. They desire Armageddon. I'm going to stop right there. The term radical dispensationalism is an unnecessary redundancy, and it gives a very false picture of what exactly dispensationalism is. For those of you who don't know, dispensationalism is a view of the Bible that states that there are two separate co-equal covenants, one made in the New Testament to the Gentiles and one that is still in effect in the Old Testament for the Jews and for the nation-state of Israel. This is a view of theology that I do not embrace because it runs counter to more than 1,800 years of established Christian dogma, both before and after the Reformation. And all parties were in agreement on this point up until the late 19th century. To anyone who is familiar with this ideology, I will simply state the following. If you have the viewpoint that there is a rapture before the tribulation and that it is near at hand and that it will take a certain shape or form that is conducive to the lunacy that is pushed by Harold Camping or John Hagee, the word radical goes without saying because it leads to a radical ideology that is rabidly pro-Israel no matter what. These people regularly excuse the abuses committed in the name of Israel either by this country or by that country. The law of God is a very important thing unless as it applies to the abuses that Israel commits in the name of its alleged defense. For anyone who is a lover of the law of God and who believes that they are elect in Christ, you cannot be a dispensationalist and be a Christian, in my opinion, and in the opinion of just about every one of the early church fathers of the Christian faith, and in the case of the scriptures as well. But anyway, I'm going to get off the soapbox there and get back to what I was talking about here before, which was reading this article. Their millennial passion disposes them to support candidates who advocate expanding the wars in the Middle East in order to bring on the second coming of Christ. Yes, this I agree with. Which will apparently inaugurate his 1,000-year reign, which they will then share with him. These voters are not inconsequential in number and influence. In 2008, for instance, both Huckabee and McCain slavishly sought the blessing of Pastor John Hagee of San Antonio's Cornerstone Church, the founder and leader of Christians United for Israel. Hagee finally endorsed McCain, only to find McCain denouncing the endorsement because Hagee's long history of anti-Catholicism. Which brings us to the Catholics. The Catholic faith does not applaud Armageddon or urge its early arrival. I would state just right here in regards to this that Armageddon is an unavoidable prophetic occurrence. At some point in time, the world is going to end. All things that have a beginning have an end. I don't applaud people who try to bring about Armageddon through acts of wickedness. Nevertheless, if it's in God's plan, there's no way that we should be treating it in any negative fashion, provided that it is actually God's plan. But anyway, continuing. Of course, we pray thy kingdom come, but we do not pretend to know the day or the hour. This is a little bit of better language here. As far as Israel is concerned, Catholics believe that the Catholic Church, and not any specific ethnic group or geographic territory, is the new Israel. I agree with this also. However, the Roman system is at odds with the original understanding of Catholicism, and that's why I am not in communion with them. Continuing. So why aren't Catholic leaders inclined to applaud and even zealously support Ron Paul, not only for his fiscal honesty, but for his opposition to abortion and Roe v. Wade? I would like to add right here that Ron Paul's fiscal honesty is actually part of the problem that Rome has with him. But continuing on. Sure, dispensationalists might oppose him because of his condemnation of Bush-Obama's illegal wars, but Catholics have no similar theological calling to do so. In fact, they have good reason to resonate that condemnation. So what's Ron Paul's Catholic problem? When offered this pro-life constitutionalist who reflects the moral views of millions of Catholics, why do prominent Catholics follow the lead of the secular liberal media and treat Dr. Paul like the 13th floor of a hotel? I think a great deal of the problem lies not with the people in the pews, but with professional Catholics who have put their faith in the Republican Party, specifically with the GOP establishment left behind by George W. Bush. Specifically, many people among the establishment's Catholic faction are closely identified with the Iraq War and to this day long to vindicate their support of it. These self-appointed professional Catholics do not represent all the faithful, of course. Congressman Walter Jones of North Carolina, of Freedom Fries fame, was honest enough to say publicly what many Republicans thought privately. The Iraq War was a mistake, and he said so, admitting that he was wrong to support it. Nor does it include all pro-lifers. Yes, after watching Obama's strident support of abortion and gay marriage, many Catholics believe that the Republican Party is their only hope, but "put not your hope in princes" certainly rings true here. The GOP has used, abused, and betrayed pro-lifers for decades. The problem rests with a small group of Catholics chosen and cultivated by Karl Rove, who were given entry to the White House early on in Bush's presidency. With their help, Rove traveled the country speaking to leaders of various interest groups that he identified and assiduously cultivated. In one city after another, he would meet with pro-life, pro-family groups on one floor of a hotel, and then went upstairs to meet with another group that supported the government of Israel. For Rove, getting Catholics to support the war was a high priority, while there were no parallel efforts on the other side. And let me just stop right here. While I will concur that Karl Rove has a lot of blame in shifting what little actual pro-free market, pro-smaller government Catholic contingent there is in this country in favor of the neoconservative position, I argue that this is largely a minority position, and when you look at the Roman Catholic Church's traditional view of social justice, the problem with Ron Paul in their eyes is not that he's anti-war and that he's pro-life. The problem is that he is pro-free market and basically pro-freedom. That kind of runs contrary to the Roman notion of social justice, and I'll get into this a bit later after the article's concluded. Well, that is except for Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later to become Pope Benedict, both of whom profoundly opposed the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. At Pope John Paul's beatification this past May 1st, his closest friend and confidant, Cardinal Deut, described how the Pope expressed real anger only twice in his reign, condemning the mafia in southern Italy and condemning the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Pity poor Jim Nicholson, the Catholic who Bush appointed as his envoy to the Holy See, whose job it was to sell Bush's war to a pope who opposed it so strongly. Other Catholic neocons like George Weigel, Michael Novak, Father Richard Niehaus, and William McGurn also fervently supported the war in any way they could. In a way, their support was somehow ironic. The Iraq War kicked to the back burner all efforts to advance the pro-life, pro-family cause. Attorney General John Ashcroft, one of the most ardent defenders of the family ever to hold that position, once told me, when I lived next door to him, that the war on terror was his first priority, and he never got to address other pro-family priorities like abortion and internet obscenity. While Bush would have lost both the elections in 2000 and 2004 without support from pro-life Catholics, he brought into his inner circle only pro-war Catholics. They did their best to give the war a Catholic imprimatur, concocting an upside-down version of just war theory twisted to justify the unjustifiable, preemptive war. They threw 1,500 years of just war tradition down the memory hole, but that is the neocon dialectic at work. Nothing is true forever, and after all, 9/11 changed everything. One of the most disingenuous of these depredations came from William McGurn, who left his post as chief editor at the Wall Street Journal to work as Bush's chief speechwriter, and later returned to News Corp as Rupert Murdoch's speechwriter. In 2007, when Pope Benedict visited the White House, McGurn used his journal column to announce that Pope Benedict had somehow changed his mind and now actually supported the war in Iraq. I recently asked him about that at a Washington function. The usual loquacious wordsmith roared, "I don't want to talk about it," and turned on his heel. An uncommon reaction for a celebrated conservative who is a frequent speaker on the Catholic circuit. In sum, a small group of professional Catholic apologists for President Bush pushed the war to the front burner, leaving serious issues like abortion, internet obscenity, and other issues important to the indispensable pro-family coalitions to gather dust. During the 2004 campaign, Rove admitted as much and promised pro-family leaders that after the election, their issues would finally get attention. But that never really came to pass. The endless disastrous conduct of the war virtually blocked them out. And no, Karl Rove never apologized. A specific and troubling vector has emerged in the crusade for secular democracy on the part of professional Christians, including Catholics. They virtually ignore the persecution, killing, forced emigration of Christians from Iraq caused by the Iraq War. Curiously, President Bush, who many hailed as a good Christian, did not manifest any interest in the plight of Iraqi Christians, their pastors, their families, or their churches. Clearly, they were not ignorant of it. Mr. McGurn had foreseen that very prospect in the journal as early as 2003, but he was strangely silent thereafter when the persecution was widespread, murderous, and rampant. Mr. McGurn did not respond to a request for comment for this article. So today's strange professional Catholic silence regarding Ron Paul is not surprising, even though he is a champion of every Catholic conservatives believe in. It's humorous, really. Pro-life Catholics are often ridiculed as being single-issue voters. However, pro-war Catholic neocons, to whom the war was the paramount issue, don't have to deal with that criticism. Take Rick Santorum, who seizes every opportunity to condemn Ron Paul's foreign policy of defending America rather than exporting secular democracy. Santorum is at the bottom of the polls because he toured Pennsylvania with George W. Bush in 2004, supporting the re-election of Senator Arlen Specter, the ardently pro-choice Specter was the #1 target of pro-life groups nationwide. But for Santorum, backing Bush's war was apparently more important than the life issues. As a result, he lost his own election bid by 20 points in 2006, with the help of my vote, I might add. Continuing on. Santorum is a sore loser. He can't stand Ron Paul because Dr. Paul's very presence mocks Santorum's hypocrisy, not to mention his oversized ego. On polls, Santorum is regularly in the 1% range, while Ron Paul heads for the first tier as one GOP pygmy presidential after another takes a tumble. Santorum proudly sings his own praises as a family man, but can't find a kind word for the doctor who has delivered 4,000 babies without ever seeing a medical case that required abortion. The petulant Santorum doesn't aim his spiteful cheap shots at his fellow pygmies, several of whom know nothing about foreign policy besides chanting the Stop Iran mantra. He blasts Ron Paul, who has spent years on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and who towers above him in consistency and principle. But Santorum is a player. He became a hero to pro-life Catholics when he opposed partial birth abortion in the 1990s. He knows that more than 1% of Republican primary voters are pro-life and is vexed that they continue voting for other candidates. He considers himself the natural beneficiary of their votes, ignoring his own flip-flopping past, and when you support Arlen Specter, that's all pro-lifers need to know. You're finished. It's the same syndrome that Mitt Romney runs into. Romneycare and his support for choice on abortion in Massachusetts alone are enough to alienate a majority of Republican voters. Nonetheless, Santorum represents the views of the professional Catholic political establishment. After his defeat, he joined the same think tank that Elliott Abrams has run in the 1990s. Abrams, who pleaded guilty to federal charges of withholding information from Congress in '91, was pardoned by Bush 41 the next year. Wonder of wonders, he was nonetheless hired by Bush 43 to run his Middle East foreign policy at the NSC. Abrams undoubtedly shares some blame for the ensuing Iraq disaster, but like his fellow failures, he has never apologized either. Neocons never do. Losers seem to flock together, alas, and to persist now. Santorum pouts that the U.S. has lost the war and blames Obama. Only Ron Paul dares to remind the Republican pygmies that all the country's problems did not begin on January 20th, 2009. He adds that Republican Congresses were also complicit in Bush's domestic failures and his unconstitutional foreign wars. Such honesty is so refreshing that Washington's establishment, where down is up, finds it asphyxiating. The hot tub crowd returns the favor by doing everything it can to suck the air out of Ron Paul's campaign, because every one of the other current GOP candidates suffer from flaws that would be fatal in the real world. Ron Paul might wind up as the last man standing. Hot tubbers would be aghast, of course, but if Ron Paul wins the nomination, can we expect some professional Catholics to foment an undercurrent of resentment and retaliation? It does not matter that America's Catholic bishops have finally discovered that the Obama administration is the most anti-Catholic, anti-Christian administration in history. For these diehards, Obama is just the competition. Ron Paul is the enemy. After all, self-vindication is a high priority inside the Beltway, right up there with the endless wars. Why else did God invent memoirs? And that concludes the article. There's a lot of stuff in this article that I agree with and that I think is good to point out. However, one of the points that I strongly believe is being missed here by Mr. Mannion is a good amount of history regarding Rome's stance on economics. When you look in Europe, wherever you find politically active Roman Catholics, you don't find capitalists, you don't find free marketers, you don't find libertarians, you find social democrats, you find so-called middle-of-the-road third-way quasi-fascistic corporatists who think that government and industry must be joined at the hip and must partner up together in order to keep the economy going. This is exactly the same ideology that America is currently under the tyranny of, only we have the delusion of thinking that we're still living in a free market, and thus we provide fodder for demagoguing fools churned out of the Jesuit schools such as Michael Moore, who insists that capitalism is destroying the country, and then yet later admitting that we don't actually have a fully capitalist system. There are a lot of points that I could get into regarding the Jesuit order and how they are basically at the forefront of destroying what little bit of capitalism is left in America, but instead what I'm going to do for the remainder of this video is I am going to focus in particularly on something that is a bit older than the Jesuits and something that has been a critical flaw in Roman Catholicism and also to an extent also in Eastern Orthodoxy, and it has to do specifically with monasticism and the vows that go with them. And for those of you that may wonder, as a post-Port Royal Jansenist living in the modern era, there are some differences of opinion that I have with Bishop Jansen and with all of the people at the Port Royal convent. And that is, I do not believe in the sacrament of holy orders. As a result, I'm actually at odds with them. I'm in perfect communion with the old Catholic Church on this point because they've also gotten rid of monastical vows, probably because they have a much better grasp of Scripture. But the old Jansenists were still largely in agreement that monastic vows were a valid way of serving God. I'm just going to briefly touch upon the three things that are most cherished within monasteries. And this is actually something that was noted by Bill Press, the famed lunatic liberal, who has his own radio show that frequently gets featured on Radio Equalizer. The three virtues espoused in monastic religious life are poverty, singleness, and obedience. Now, what's missing from these three things, just to start off with before I deal with each one specifically? Poverty, chastity, or single life is actually the more appropriate term, and obedience. Well, Honesty is obviously missing from the equation now, isn't it? Where's honesty in this equation? Where's adherence to law? Well, they would argue obedience, but obedience to what? And this is where we need to get specific. In regards to the vow of chastity, the practical outworkings of this are not what they seem. What a monastery demands of a monk, either a religious monk or a teaching priest, is perpetual single life. And since the sacrament of confession has been so grossly cheapened by the Jesuits that a mere attritional fear of hell is sufficient for expiation, you can violate the implicit vow of chastity that they claim is worked into that perpetual single life vow in a number of different ways and simply confess it, and you're off the hook, at least according to the Church. It's not really much of a wonder why sexual perversion and hypocrisy is so rampant amongst Catholic priests and monks, and why, if you read the history of Catholic holy orders, it is rampant with infidelity, with whoremongering, and with buggery. When you hold as a virtue the notion that perpetual single life, which I argue is something that no man born in sin is capable of, above the lawful and approved institution of marriage, you're opening the door to all kinds of things. And there's scripture that agrees very fervently with me on this. And I'm actually going to cite some of it for you right now, just so you can have just a little taste of where Rome is very much missing the boat on these things. But ask yourself just this question. Are monastical vows of perpetual single life in accordance with the Bible? Well, let's look up a couple verses and see here. I'm going to start with the book of Acts. And the specific verse that I'm going to look up is Acts chapter 20, verses 12 and 14. And I'm going to read this out of the King James Version, since that's the version that is most widely known, and also because when you take the direct English translation of the Vulgate, it sounds extremely archaic, even when compared to the archaic Old New English King James Version. Acts 23, verse 12. And when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. 14. And they came to the chief priests and elders and said, We have bound ourselves under a great curse that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul. These were people that profess to believe in the Ten Commandments. And I'm using this just to start off with what these illicit vows can lead to. The Ten Commandments specifically state, Thou shalt not kill. These people in the book of Acts are asking God to help them in breaking one of his commandments. And furthermore, they attach to it a vow that they will not eat or drink. In other words, they won't follow the command to preserve their own lives, as they are also created in the image of God, thus compounding the error. So this is just to give you a little taste of what happens, what can happen when you get out of control with vowing to do things, essentially putting a hedgerow before the hedgerow and saying, I'm going to go above and beyond the call of duty. I am not only going to follow the Ten Commandments, I am actually going to go beyond them in the name of serving God. or in serving his church, actually, is the more appropriate term. Okay, now, for something specific pertaining to what I stated about marriage. Let's go to the gospel here. Matthew 19, verses 11 and 12. Here we go. But he said unto them, all men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs which were born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. But, now mind you, but, here it's establishing the actual ability to do this. And when the Bible talks about eunuchs, in the case of being born from it, they're being born being able to abstain. Not that they're born missing the equipment, just so there's no confusion there. And it's the same with all of the others, whether they're doing it for a part of their life or the majority of their life because they've devoted themselves to some specific work that's laid out in the gospel. Now, we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 2 and 9. Here we go. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Verse 9. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Ask yourselves about this. The Roman Catholic Church teaches very clearly that marriage is a good thing. In fact, they actually went so far as to make it a sacrament. But they put this holy orders stuff well above it. And when they go for the people that they canonize and beatify as saints, they go to holy orders. They don't go to those lay persons that are actually fulfilling the duty of Genesis to be fruitful and multiply. And just to provide a little bit of further perspective, since people might accuse me of simply quote mining from the Bible, let's go to a separate book here. Let's say we go to Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4. Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. Sounds like marriage is a pretty good thing. Now, for my personal favorite, 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 and 3. Now the Spirit speaketh expressly, that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of evil. Verse 3. Forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from meats, which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth. Now, in addition to forbidding marriage to members of the clergy, anybody who's spent an entire Advent year in communion with the Roman Catholic Church knows full well about the prohibition from consuming meat on Fridays during Lent. I think I can kind of hang my hat on that one there. But since the overall purpose of this is economics, let me move on now to the monastical vow of poverty. Those in the atheist community do get a few things right occasionally, and one of the things that they get right is the rampant corruption in the banking system at the Vatican and the banking practices of holy orders. Think about this for a second. Anybody who's read any history regarding the monastic orders of the medieval church, and even up to this day, will know that these holy orders are swimming in money. Mother Teresa, vow of poverty. Does anybody have any idea how much money was at her disposal to do with whatever she saw fit to do with? I'm not sure. I will try to find a link to put in the description to give a rough ballpark. But I'll tell you right now, it's a heck of a lot more money than you or I will probably see in our lifetimes. The actual vow that holy orders take with regard to ownership is not real poverty. These people don't go without food except for when they voluntarily fast. These people don't live in rags, sleeping in doorways or in trash cans or in cardboard boxes on the street. These people sleep in relative comfort, in lodges and in abbeys owned by the monasteries. They're guaranteed food, they're guaranteed sustenance. They're not living in real poverty. They might be living a more outwardly humble life than some of the lavish people that lap up the bling-bling culture here in America, but they're not living in poverty. What the holy orders are actually living in is professed poverty, which means that they profess that they don't own the things that they use. I don't think I really need to go too far into the concept of how absurd it is to say that you don't own what you're eating for dinner. You're working, you're doing something that specifically pertains to a particular task and a particular organization, and that organization as a result is providing you with food and sustenance, lodging and clothing. The entire delusion of collectively owned property, socialism, and communism is tied in very directly with this notion of professed poverty being a virtue. Something which I find utterly ridiculous. When people state that it is good to be poor, I laugh at them. And when they lecture me that the Bible says that it's good to be poor, au contraire. Let's look at a couple verses here and see what the attitude of the Bible is with regards to professed poverty. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28. Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth. This verse basically lays out the entire structure upon which ownership and charity is based. You cannot gain anything without some method of labor, preferably productive labor because it yields the best results. Now answer this question. How is it that charity, acts of giving alms, can exist without somebody committing some form of productive labor? What can establishments which command professed poverty do to help this basic equation and to make charity more charitable? The answer is absolutely nothing. The only thing that they can do is turn the practice into a bureaucratic nightmare, which is what happens. This is the reason why charitable donations have such a hard time getting to where they need to go, because we're wrapped up in this worship of institutions over people, rather than the other way around. Institutions don't exist without people, therefore it should necessarily follow that it is the workings of people that should take precedence over the will of institutions. But anyway, let's take this a little bit further, since once again I'm probably going to be accused of simply mining one quote for my personal convenience. Let's go to the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 7. If there be among you a poor man of one of thy brethren within any of thy gates in thy land which is the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not harden thine heart, nor shut thine hand from thy poor brother. So, we're given a very clear command right here, that we should not harden our hearts and we should give to the poor. We should not allow people to live in squalor. Let me ask you this. If it is not good to allow people to live in squalor, to live in poverty, then what business do we have going around professing to be in poverty? Shouldn't we aspire to do something productive so that we have the means to offer alms to those who have come to a state of poverty, to help them along so that they can get back on their feet? But anyway, once again, more quotes are likely needed in order to make my case, so I will go to the book of Proverbs, the most anti-communistic book in the entire Bible. Proverbs chapter 30, verses 8 and 9. Remove far from me vanity and lies. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with food convenient for me, lest I be full and deny thee and say, Who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and take the name of my God in vain. What we have here is a very, very clear condemnation of any desire for either poverty or excessive riches. What we're specifically laid out here with is the building blocks of the concept of the middle class, the people that actually move the ball forward, the people that make things happen, the thing it makes possible. Yes, even the excesses of the rich and the destitution of the poor, both of which can be fixed simply by adhering to the principles that a man ought not be so cavalier with his wealth that he starts throwing it after poor causes. You know, a lot of people out there say that greed is good. You know something? I will agree in the sense that greed motivated towards productiveness, which in turn may yield charity. If that's how you're defining greed, that's not something that I would condemn. However, greed in its actual original definition is an irrational love of money that specifically leads people to do unlawful and questionable things in order to obtain it, and often leads to people disposing of their wealth in illicit means. The excesses of the wealthy people that control the government of America are a prime example of this. What are we doing with the wealth that this government has amassed onto itself? Blowing up things and killing people. That is an example of true greed. And then also on the other side, the poor. Our government has made an absolute virtue out of being poor. We love the poor to the point that we create poor people so that we can hook them on welfare and make sure they vote for the right politicians, many of them Roman Catholics. Anyhow, in the interest of further proving my point, I am going to go further into the Bible to provide yet more proof of my viewpoint. Genesis chapter 3, verse 19. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it was thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. In other words, we will eat because we work. No work, no food. If everybody's sitting around, nobody's eating. Yet another verse. Let's go to the epistles now. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 11. And that ye study to be quiet, and to do your own business, and to work with your own hands, as we commanded you. The first part of this particular verse here, and that ye study to be quiet, and that ye do your own business. What does this say for all of the busybodies out there going around telling everybody, you must give me money so that I can help the poor? The proper response to that, obviously, is, well, what's stopping me from helping the poor? Point these people out to me and I'll take my money to them myself. I don't have to worry about whether or not you're trustworthy. I don't even know you. That is the confession of every taxpayer right there. Nobody, not even the people in the districts that elect these congressmen, really know their congressmen very well. How can you know that these people are actually trustworthy to actually send the money where it supposedly needs to go? Aye. So what's the point I'm getting at here? The Roman view of charity is tied up in bureaucratic institutions. The Catholic Church, particularly the post-Trent Roman Catholic Church, is the archetype around which every secular tyranny currently derives influence in some form or another. In Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler was throwing praise left and right at the Roman Church for its system of bureaucracy and how it was able to subvert and subsume so many. Vladimir Lenin expressed similar admiration, though not as bluntly and not as often. Probably because he had Russian Orthodox people to contend with who were probably not as hospitable to Rome's version of Christianity. So the point I'm trying to make here is simple. The problem with the post-Trent Church is that in terms of its understanding of social justice, it is completely at odds with the American view of civil society. A society where you actually follow the principle of you keep what you earn, and it is you that decides best how to deal out the loving hand of charity. And that will conclude this particular talk for this particular time. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. God be with you all.